Hello class, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be another narration of one of the chapters in our text. Next slide. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, Terrorism by the State. Next slide. Quick objectives: explain the characteristics and impact of state-sponsored terrorism, provide examples of nations that have engaged in this type of activity, compare and contrast the patronage and the assistant models of terrorism by the state, critically examine and discuss how state-sponsored terrorism can become a nation's domestic policy and provide examples, describe how a nation-state may incorporate state-sponsored terrorism into its foreign policy, and explain whether ethnic cleansing and genocide are forms of state-sponsored terrorism, and provide real-life examples of these practices. It's important to understand that there are multiple states currently in our contemporary world that are considered to be state sponsors of terrorism. So the study of this aspect of terrorism is very critical to your understanding of the phenomena itself. Next slide. The primary perspectives that we'll talk about will be understanding state-sponsored terrorism itself, state sponsorship, the patronage model, state sponsorship, the assistance model. These are the two primary models. And when you think about state-sponsored terrorism, I want you to think about this. As compared to a state versus a sub-state or a dissonant level of terrorism, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, think about the powers that a state sponsor has. Number one, they control the government, and they have the resources of government at their fingertips. And this could be the Army and the Navy. This could be the national police. And when I say national police, most of the countries that I visited overseas with the State Department and doing training, they have a national police department. They're not set up like we are with our local, state, and federal different levels with different balances and different jurisdictions. So if you are a ruler that wishes to engage in terrorism at a state level, you have a tremendous advantage just because of the level of assets that you have at your disposal. Next slide. Perspectives. Again, sponsors of terrorism, they actively promote it. When we're thinking about terrorism, state sponsors, we're talking about terrorism from above. And these are, and they promote it in different ways. Number one, enablers of terrorism, they are part of the problem, and they help enable terrorists to exist and carry out their activities. And how can they enable? Different ways. They could provide safe haven. They could provide information on finances, things of this nature. Many times your states that are enablers do not fully cooperate in counterterrorism. They may be part of the global community, but their cooperation levels are much less than, say, you would expect for any contemporary state that exists today, that looks at terrorism as a negative and a blight on international law. When we also, going back to the first one, sponsored terrorism, they actively promote it. When we think about states that are actively promoting terrorism, I want you to think about states like your rogue states, and we'll talk about this in greater length later. This would be like a state like Somalia, which is nothing but run by warlords and tribal chiefs. There is no rule of law. There is no organized government. And groups like Al-Shabaab run freely and operate freely in a state or in a nation like that. There's also another sponsor, going back to the first sponsor, that is promoting it. These are the countries that are designated by the United States State Department as state sponsors of terrorism. And there's several of those. Countries like Syria, you can see the mess Syria is in today. Countries like Iran, who is one of the greatest threats that our nation, the security of our nation faces today because of their influence in the Middle East, in particular with Shia Arabs. They are Shia Muslims, which is a minority within the Muslim community, but still they're very powerful. They're known enablers, also known sponsors. But from the sponsor perspective, think about the support that they provide to terrorist groups like Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a terrorist group based out of Lebanon. They were involved in the 1983 attack that killed 220 Marines at Beirut. They've been involved in wars with Israel. A very, very active terror group in different parts of the world. Also countries like the Sudan, and we'll talk about them a little later. And actually, you have a video to watch this week about Darfur, which is part of Sudan. And the Sudan is located in Africa. Lastly, our cooperators. They cooperate in counterterrorism efforts, yet disagree perhaps politically in other matters. And the countries that come to mind here would be a country like Pakistan. Pakistan is heavily engaged. They are an ally of ours, and they do cooperate in counterterrorism efforts. I know this for a fact because I was in it with a team of retired law enforcement officers. We went into Pakistan on behalf of the U.S. State Department. I was involved in a training course that was part of establishing a national counterterrorism center. It was a really unique experience, and I've been in Pakistan a couple of times, and I know for a fact that their national law enforcement and their military is heavily engaged in counterterrorism within the country. But at the same time, we also have political issues that we disagree with Pakistan, but they are cooperators. And this is in this security environment that exists today. Next slide. This is state terrorism and types of violence. When we look at perspectives, we have warfare using conventional forces against conventional or guerrilla enemy. This is one method. The picture here there that you see, I believe that was taken from either Bosnia or Kosovo during the civil wars there. And I know for a fact that there was, when I was in Kosovo, shortly after the bombing there, I remember visiting sites where mass killings had taken place when the Serbs were retreating from Kosovo in response to the NATO forces coming in and bombing. They did a lot of killing, a lot of assassination, a lot of torture on ethnic Albanians that were citizens of Kosovo at the time. And other perspectives, genocide or the elimination of a scapegoat group, and we'll talk about genocide a little bit later. And when we talk about genocide, this can be civilians, the state eliminating civilians. It can be soldiers. They're all treated equally as far as targeting. Lastly, assassination. This is more of a lower scale. This could be individual targeting of if it's domestic state terrorism, would be targeting of somebody that opposes the current government, somebody that's designated for murder or elimination, or it could be internationally. There's been cases where opponents of a government that live overseas have been targeted, and representatives of the government are involved in assassinating that individual or individuals in another country. Next slide. There's a picture of the current Syrian President Assad. Syria is a known and designated sponsor of state terrorism. Designated by who? The Secretary of what department? I said it before. Yes, the State Department. Syria is a mess right now, and it's so complex. You have a violent suppression of a civil war there by the so-called Syrian government led by Assad. You have elements of the Islamic State that control portions of Syria. So it's a real challenge for the civilized world in trying to deal with a country like Syria. Understanding state-sponsored terrorism on this slide It incorporates many types, and this is kind of a little bit of a repeat from the prior: warfare, genocide, assassinations, torture. And this is important to remember. The linkage between regimes and terrorism range from clear lines where it's clearly established that the state is involved in state-sponsored terrorism to very murky associations that are hard to establish. And this is also a technique that's used by some of the states that we'll talk about a little later. And some of the key concepts and two of the primary models that we'll talk about in this particular chapter are the state patronage model for terrorism and the state assistance model. Next slide. Photograph there is a picture of American nuns that were killed in Central America by death squads, and that's something that we will discuss and you'll read about in the textbook, where governments will hire what they call paramilitaries or gangs or thugs. That's part of the murky part of this aspect of terrorism, the state sponsor, to eliminate people that they identify as opposed to the current government, and in this case it was Catholic nuns. So let's talk about the patronage model. The patronage model is an actual active participation in terrorist behavior. So the state itself is actively involved. We have both foreign, which would be overseas, and domestic policy participation. One of the examples that they give there are Syria in 1982. There was an uprising within Syria by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an organization that you probably have heard about recently, because they were actually elected to leadership positions with Egypt, but they've been kicked out by the current administration. But nonetheless, in Syria, there was an uprising, and the Syrian government responded. There were actually two campaigns against the established Syrian government, and they responded to this rebellion in very, very harsh terms. In particular, in 1981, they killed a couple of hundred people, but then the Muslim Brotherhood revolted again, and this time they came in to suppress this civil disobedience and uprising with troops and tanks and artillery, and they killed approximately 25,000 civilians and destroyed large portions of cities. So again, this is important to remember. They weren't just targeting members of the Muslim Brotherhood that were part of these rebel groups. They were targeting civilians, and that's where you cross over into terrorism, as you know. And obviously for political reasons, simply to maintain control of the country. Another example they talk about in the book is the 2008 assassination of a Hezbollah commander, and this was by Israel, allegedly by Israel. Of course, they deny culpability, and this would be one of those murky associations where it's alleged that a state engages in state-sponsored terrorism. And of course, you have your South and Central American death squads, and these were paramilitary groups that were either put together by left-wing or right-wing administrations during very tumultuous times in the 1970s and 80s within South and Central America. And as a result, you have people that are targeted, civilians, or anybody that opposes the current government. And they would engage in terrorist activities to maintain control. But again, with the patronage model, you have direct arming of terrorists, training, providing safe haven or sanctuary. And what they mean by that is, let's say a terrorist carries out an attack in a foreign country. He comes back to his patronage country, and they hide him out and provide him safe haven until things cool off so he doesn't get captured if he does escape. It's important to remember, too, that if, even with the patronage model, how they justify their activities is very, very clever, and something we will talk about. Again, this is a repeat. Government supports or champions the violent movement outside its borders. So it can be part of their foreign policy. In other words, you could have a government. I like to pick on Iran. You take a government like Iran, who will support movements outside their government, and they look at that as an advantage to them. They use these outside movements to target their external foreign enemies. And so if Israel is obviously an enemy to Iran, they can use Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon, to carry out attacks. They become the proxy of the state patronage, which is Iran, and it can be part of their foreign policy. I mean, they're doing it on purpose. They see it as a necessary tactic. What's the rationalization? Pretty simple. They will provide, sometimes they will admit that they support a proxy, but they'll also say that terrorism is a necessary tactic given the circumstances. Sometimes they'll deny what's happened, they'll deny all involvement, or issue a blanket statement. That's the easiest thing to do, that say violence is unfortunate. So even as a patronage, where you can draw a direct link at times, and sometimes you cannot, they'll still try to deny that they have anything to do with it. They also talk about the United States in our textbook. And in the early 1980s, we were involved in supporting a rebel group called the Contras that were involved in trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua, which was a left-wing government called the Sandinistas. And as it turned out, the Contras, who we were arming and training, were also engaged in terrorist activity and human rights violation. When this surfaced, it became quite an embarrassment to the United States, and Congress pulled the money from this funding. But as you'll learn later in the readings, that's when the United States actually set up a resupply. They did it in a different way without Congress's knowledge to continue to support the Nicaraguan Contras, and that eventually came back to be a real embarrassment to the administration, President Reagan. And there were congressional hearings. That's where Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North testified and became somewhat quite famous. Next slide. Again, patronage, those are the things I've already talked to you about. Suppress a clear and present domestic threat to national. This is where patronage would be a domestic policy. In other words, they target a domestic group within their own country. Okay, and it would be state security personnel that are conducting the actions. The rationalizations are suppress a clear and present domestic threat to national security. That's how they justify it. Maintain law and order. Protect the cultural values of the nation that are threatened by the subversives, and restore stability to the government. And these are all justifications, essentially, or rationalizations to carry out terrorist activity against your own people. And we're not again, civilians are targets. That's where they cross the line. Again, another great example was in Syria with their overkill in the suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. Next slide. Picture of one of the Ayatollahs in Iran. The assistance model. This is another major model within the environment, the terrorist environment. Again, just going back to our state terrorism, remember, it's the most organized, they have the most resources, and violence can be forced on those dissident groups below. And we now know, just a little quick review, that they'll use paramilitary or proxies, people acting on their behalf that can't be tied back to them. They'll argue there's no connection. These are secret operations, covert operations, and they will identify perceived enemies that are both external and internal. And this could be, that's where their foreign policy comes in, or their domestic policy. All right, let's go back to our assistance model. These are tacit state participation in terrorist behavior. In other words, indirect suppression. A lot of times they'll use proxies. And when I mean proxies is somebody that is acting on their behalf but doesn't wear the uniform of the state, or if you looked at them you would know they were part of the state. Both foreign and domestic participation can be in the assistance model. Some of the rationalizations they'll use are different. But let's going back to the slide here, let's look at the examples. Nicaragua, which I've already explained to you, with the Contras, the Iran-Contras. Syria with the Muslim Brotherhood. They're also involved in the assistance model. And not only with the Muslim Brotherhood, Syria is also involved in supporting other terrorist groups, providing assistance, providing safe haven to these groups. The Syrians are known to support Hezbollah, but now they've recently had some problems with Hezbollah, but in the past, the movement of arms from Iran through Syria into Lebanon was one of the conduits to arm the Hezbollah terrorists. Indirect support, they could indirectly arm, train, and provide sanctuary, indirectly arming somebody, maybe routing the arms to other countries so it can't be tracked back to them, providing money for training that occurs in other countries where it can't be directly tied to them, or even providing sanctuary. Of course, if they provided sanctuary and these individuals were identified in their country, they would just deny that they had any knowledge that they were there. It was interesting. I like the discussion about the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which occurred from about 1965 to 64. This is dealing with Mao Zedong, and there's a lot of discussion in the book about it. But essentially, there was revisionism ideas that he perceived that existed within the communist state there in Red China. After, this is after the communists had taken over the country, and he felt that these tendencies in society for revision were a threat. And so what they wanted to do was indoctrinate this new generation of communists within China. And they called them the Red Guards, and they recruited millions of young supporters that were mobilized by the Maoists, or the Chinese communists. And they were told, they were trained to attack the old ideas. And the old ideas, they called it the four olds in the textbook: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And so what they're doing is creating a new vanguard within the young, a new generation of revolutionaries, and instigating this cultural revolution. The instigation came as a assistance in domestic policy from the government itself. And so you see great turmoil. They seize control of the government bureaucracies, the Red Guards. And so ultimately what happens is then the government uses the, quote, People's Liberation Army to restore order. But they've accomplished what they wanted to do. They used these proxies. They've developed another vanguard of young revolutionaries, and they've suppressed the old ideas and helped maintain control. Just remember that, again, with the assistance model, there's less explicit support, murky connections. The state uses proxies and agents, and sometimes it's difficult to make that connection. And they'll deny complicity if faced with exposure. And again, with the assistance model, there's your rationalizations. Blame the adversary, argue that the proxy violence is evidence of the popular patriotic sentiment to suppress a threat to national security, call on the hostilities to cease, even though they're the ones that perhaps are involved in instigating it, ensure the people that the government is doing all it can to restore order. Next slide. Domestic terrorism by the state. Again, this is within the same. Legitimized state authority. Unofficial repression. Vigilante domestic state. Using vigilantes. Again, people that can't be connected back. They also use repression as an official domestic state terrorism and mass repression. And that could get into genocide, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's important to remember that every type of regime tries to legitimize its authority and maintain its social order. And that's in all democracies and some of the other types of what we would call state authority classifications that we'll talk about. And that includes democracy, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and crazy states. Let's go to the next slide. This is a good table out of the textbook. You got your models of state authority, for example, democracy, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and crazy states. As you read across the different, to understand the chart or the table itself, you got legitimization of authority within a democracy. The secondary role of security institutions, you have a strong constitution and rule of law. You go to the center of authorities, the government with constrained authority. In other words, they can't just do whatever they want. And examples would be the United States, Western Europe, Japan, your Western democracies. You can read most of these yourself, but let's go down to totalitarianism. The legitimization is the central role of official security institutions. Center of authority is government. In a totalitarianism government has unconstrained authority. This would be your China, your North Korea, your Taliban regime. Government controls everything. And then lastly, we have our crazy states. You have central roles of official and unofficial security institutions. You have government with unconstrained authority or unconstrained paramilitaries or both. And here you have, when I think of governments like in Somalia as one example, it's really run by warlords and chieftains. There is no rule of law. Liberia for a long time, and Uganda under the dictator of Idi Amin. Tremendous atrocities on its people. So it's important to understand the levels of state domestic authority that exist under the different models of state authority to help you better understand where terrorism activity. So think about in a crazy state, terrorists can train, they can arm themselves, they have safe haven without constraint. Normally in those places, all they have to do is pay off the local warlord and they can operate as they see fit. Under a totalitarianism government like China, they're known for their repression of ideas, the repression of any sort of opposition to the state, and then they would have unconstrained authority to suppress a revolution, or even not even a revolution, ideas that are contrary to the Communist Party, say, in a country like China or North Korea. And of course, in the Taliban, if you don't adhere to the their strict interpretation of society within the very, very strict Muslim religion, fundamentalist Islamic religion as they perceive of it, then you'll be murdered, you'll be killed, you'll be ostracized. Very, very brutal regimes, all of them. Next slide. A good example of state-sponsored terrorism, domestic terrorism, and this deals with the video that you're supposed to watch, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But this occurred in Darfur. You had the Janjaweed, and Darfur is is in the Western Sudan, a Muslim country. The culture within that country is Arab and African, and the rulers of the country are what's called Arabized Sudanese. And so you had two rebel movements within Darfur that were anti-government. They carried out some attacks against the government, and then the response was just overwhelming. And the government used a proxy, which are the Janjaweed. It's a militia. Janjaweed means men on horses, and they engaged in a tremendous unleash of genocide on the Muslim population, and they're Muslims themselves. 50,000 people killed, hundreds of thousands driven from their homes, women raped, homes burned, etc. You'll see it in the tape. Next slide. Again, state terrorism is domestic policy, vigilante state terrorism, unofficial repression. You have quiet state support. So in other words, you have death squads. Latin America was famous for their death squads. Remember the picture of the dead nuns that were targeting people that were considered to be in opposition to the government. Terrorism perpetrated by non-government groups and individuals, and of course, when exposed, the state itself will deny any affiliation. Next slide. Here's a picture of Joseph Stalin, another example of official state terrorism repression as a state domestic policy. Famous for the adoption of domestic terrorism. Their goal is, if they're in charge, their goal is to preserve the existing order. So the existing order could mean their totalitarianism government, and they have no qualms with engaging in domestic terrorism against their own people to maintain control. Think about the policies of Stalinist Russia, the murder, the shipment of entire segments of the population to work camps in different parts of the country, to labor camps where they died. It's estimated that 20 million Russians died because of the policies of the Stalinist Russia during the Soviet Union times. You have the Nazi Germany, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Next slide. Again, mass repression. We have examples here of genocidal domestic state terrorism, and that was the Anfal campaign in Iraq against the Kurds. And in that case, Saddam Hussein was known for gassing the Kurds, killing innocent women and children, dropping chemical gas to kill that population as part of his domestic state terrorism policy to repress any segment of that country that didn't agree or didn't support his ideals and his vision for the country. Genocide is a crime. Acts classified as genocide against a group to destroy in whole or part because of its national, ethnic, racial, and religious reasons. There's several examples of genocide that are given in the book. Many times they are definitely connected to state-sponsored terrorism, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harms or mental harm. That could be done through rape, trying to physically destroy the group, preventing births, or forcibly taking the children away. Next slide. Ethnic cleansing is the expulsion of an ethno-national group from a geographic region as a means to create an ethnically pure society. In the Bosnian War, you saw it on both sides. The Bosnian Serbs that were supported by Serbia trying to rid the society of Muslims, and then the Muslims in response engaged in terrorist activity to rid the society of Serb Christians. And this is an example of some of the camps in Bosnia. And this is not that long ago. We're talking about the 1990s. So this is not not much different than the Nazi concentration camps that you saw during World War II. Same concept. Next slide. Terrorism is foreign policy, moral support, politically sympathetic sponsorship. They can provide technical support, episodes, selective participation in specific episodes, not everything, but maybe certain activities, or they conduct joint operations.